Each evening they returned, risking scolding or worse. He learned their rhythm, footsteps through the grass. I grew up believing my father was a hard man, the kind who'd seen too much to be gentle. But I was wrong. One story he never meant for me to find proved it. It wasn't about a battle or a medal. It was about two little girls who saved a man the world had already decided wasn't worth saving. I first found mention of them in his old field notebook, the same one he carried everywhere after the war. Half the pages were filled with repairs he'd made on tractors and fence posts. But wedged between those ordinary lines was a paragraph that stopped me cold. Found by two children near the cedar grove. Thought I was finished. I owe them everything. No names, no dates. Just that. For weeks I couldn't shake it from my mind, so I began piecing together what little I knew. Old photos, a map, stories my father used to half start and then swallow back down. This is what I believe happened. It was the autumn of 1961. He was 32 then. A handsome, broad-shouldered man hardened by months of border duty. A routine patrol had gone wrong. Gunfire, chaos, men scattering through the hills. He'd been hit by shrapnel along his ribs, nothing fatal but enough to make every breath feel borrowed. By the time he stumbled out of the tree line, his uniform was torn and the world around him had gone quiet except for crows. He told no one where he was headed. Maybe he didn't know himself. He followed the smell of wood smoke, hoping to find a farmhouse, a shed, anything. Instead, he collapsed beside a pile of autumn leaves and drifted in and out of fevered dreams. That's where they found him. Two sisters from a nearby village, maybe 10 and 12 years old. They were gathering kindling when they saw his boots sticking out from under the brush. He said later he woke to the sound of whispering and the weight of small hands trying to lift his head. They knew at once he wasn't one of their own. Different insignia, different tongue. They could have run, should have. Instead, one of them pressed a canteen to his lips while the other pulled her shawl around his shoulders. He tried to speak but only managed a rasp that turned into a cough. The younger girl whispered something he couldn't understand, then smiled, the kind of smile people give when they don't yet know fear. Together they dragged him inch by inch to an old storage barn half hidden by vines. They brought him water first, then bread, then herbs stolen from their mother's kitchen. Each evening they returned, risking scolding or worse. He learned their rhythm. Footsteps through the grass, a soft knock. Giggles quickly shushed, and slowly the fever broke. When he could finally sit up, he asked them why. Why help a man their families were taught to hate? The older one shrugged. Because you looked like somebody's papa. He said that answer undid him more than the wound ever had. For a week he regained strength in that barn, listening to the sound of the sisters humming songs he didn't know. He tried to teach them a few words from his own language, and they laughed when he got theirs wrong in return. When it came time to leave, he gave them his compass. Scratched, dented, still pointing north. The older girl refused at first. He told her, "Keep it so you'll never lose your way back to kindness." That was the last line in his notebook before the story ended. But I know he never forgot them. Even years later, when he'd stare off during supper, his eyes carried the same faraway softness. He built his whole life on the lesson those two little girls taught him, that mercy doesn't need permission. And I suppose that's why I'm telling it now. Because every time the world tries to divide itself again, I think of those sisters kneeling beside a dying man who wasn't supposed to be theirs to save, and doing it anyway. After reading my father's note about the sisters, I couldn't rest until I knew what became of them. The compass he'd given them was still in our attic, tucked inside an old tin box with his medals. I held it one night and realized the hinge creaked exactly like the one he used to open when he cleaned his boots before bed. He kept that compass his whole life, or at least the memory of it. He once told me when I was just a boy that gratitude can haunt a man more quietly than guilt. Back then I didn't understand. Now I do. After his recovery, he never went back to his old post. He was discharged, half-healed and half-tired of uniforms. The papers said medical leave, but I think he just couldn't bear to fight anymore. Not after being saved by the kind of people he was ordered to see as enemies. He spent the next few years rebuilding his life in silence. He opened a workshop, fixed tools for farmers, mended radios, and sent money home to my mother before they were married. Every evening he'd walk to the hill above town where you could see the faint outline of the border and stand there until the sun went down. He'd never speak of what he thought about, but his eyes always seemed to be searching for something far away. In 1968, 7 years after the war's end, he heard there had been a drought across the line. Families leaving, villages emptying out. That's when he packed a small cart with grain, blankets, and medicine. He didn't ask permission from anyone. He just said to my mother, if they ever needed me back then, they'd have come. She didn't stop him. She just touched his arm and said, then go. He crossed on foot the next morning before sunrise. The checkpoint guards were young and nervous. They asked where he was headed. He said, to repay a kindness that saved my life. They laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. Then they saw the crates of supplies and waved him through. The road, he remembered, was smaller now, swallowed by weeds and dust. The barn where he had recovered was gone, replaced by a patch of thorn bushes. He searched the nearby village, asking in broken words about 2 sisters. One with dark braids, one shorter, always humming. No one knew at first. Then an old man pointed toward the river and said he remembered 2 girls who used to help anyone they could, until their parents died of fever. My father walked down to where the river turned shallow, and there he found a small house made of stone and wood. Outside, 2 young women were hanging clothes to dry, maybe 18, maybe 20. He recognized them instantly, though they didn't recognize him. The older one squinted, then gasped when he said her name. She dropped the cloth and ran to him. The younger one followed, laughing through tears. He said it felt like seeing sunlight after years underground. He gave them the cart of supplies, but they refused most of it. They said, we have enough. He replied, then let me thank you anyway. They insisted he stay for supper. He said the smell of bread baking in their home was the first peace he'd known since the war. The younger sister said quietly, we never told anyone what we did. He smiled. Maybe that's why I'm still here. When he left at dawn, the older girl pressed the compass back into his hand. She said, you might need it again. He tried to refuse, but she closed his fingers around it. Kindness doesn't lose direction, she said. He returned home changed. My mother told me he seemed lighter, as if some invisible chain had fallen away. He never went back to the border again. But every spring, when the rains came, he'd disappear for a day, always returning with the smell of wildflowers on his coat. Years later, I'd find petals pressed between the pages of his notebook, the same kind those girls might have picked by the river. He never called himself a hero, but I think he became one the moment he crossed that line. Not to fight, but to give something back. The kind of hero no one writes about because he didn't win a battle. He repaid a kindness that had already won him back to humanity. My father lived a long, quiet life after that last trip across the border. He worked with his hands, taught me to mend what could be mended and to leave the rest to time. He never called himself good, but he carried himself like a man who had once been saved and never forgot it. When I was a boy, I thought his silence came from pride. Now I know it came from gratitude. He didn't talk much about the war, but sometimes at dusk, when the wind moved through the trees, he'd say, kindness doesn't choose sides. People do. That line stayed with me long after he was gone. It sounded simple back then. Now it feels like a map of his entire life. After his passing, I took over his workshop. He left behind boxes of tools, receipts, and journals filled with sketches of machines that no longer existed. Most of it was ordinary, until I found the envelope. It was tucked behind an old ledger, sealed with tape yellowed at the edges. My name was written in his careful handwriting. Inside was a folded letter, but it wasn't from him. It was addressed to him. The paper was thin, the kind that tears if you breathe too hard. At the top, written in delicate handwriting, were the words, to the man we once called the stranger by the river. I sat down right there on the workbench and read. We never forgot you, it began. The day you came back changed more than our pantry shelves. You gave us back our faith in the world. My sister and I grew up remembering the man who crossed a border not to fight, but to thank. We told our children that story whenever they asked what courage looks like. The letter went on to describe their lives, how they'd become teachers in their village, how they'd helped start a small orphan school near the river. They wrote about the seasons that had passed and how they still tended the patch of land where he'd once sat recovering in that old barn. Then came the line that stopped me. If you ever wonder whether we remember your face, we do. We see it in every act of mercy that follows. You gave us more than a story. You gave us proof that even enemies can carry grace. I had to stop reading for a while. The air in that workshop felt thick, like the years between them were still trying to breathe through the paper. At the bottom of the letter was a date, June 1984. He must have received it that same summer. I remember him being unusually quiet, spending evenings by the riverbank near our home, staring at the current as if it carried voices. I'd asked him back then what he was thinking about. He'd said, "Some debts don't need to be paid, just remembered." Now I understood what he meant. The letter had traveled across decades and 2 countries to reach him. No one knew how it found its way, but he'd kept it safe. The same way he kept his compass, the pressed petals, and the silence that followed every time someone mentioned the war. I folded the letter back into its envelope, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. It felt like holding a bridge built out of words instead of wood, fragile but strong enough to carry everything he stood for. That night I read it again aloud to my wife and our children, and as I spoke I realized I wasn't just telling them my father's story. I was telling them what it means to be human, to help someone you've been taught to hate, to remember them long after the world has moved on. My father died believing his kindness had been a small thing, but that letter proved otherwise. It had crossed borders, years, and generations just to say thank you. And I think if he could have heard it read out loud, he would have smiled the way he used to when the world surprised him with goodness. He always said gratitude has a heartbeat. Maybe this letter was proof that his never stopped. I couldn't sleep the night I found that letter. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's hands holding the same page, reading those same words for the first time. There are moments in a man's life when he realizes that gratitude can echo longer than memory itself. That night was one of them. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I needed to see the place that shaped him. The hills where he'd almost died. The river that had carried his second chance. Not out of duty, but out of a kind of ache I couldn't name. It felt like unfinished business, not for him, but for the story he'd left behind. I told my wife I'd be gone a few days. She didn't ask where, she just nodded, the way people do when they understand something without needing the details. I packed light. A change of clothes, my father's compass, and the letter that had waited 40 years to find its way home. The road to the border looked different than I remembered. Paved now, lined with new buildings, louder, faster. But the air still smelled of cedar and earth when the wind shifted. I followed the old map my father had sketched once on the back of a receipt. Rough lines, a river bend, a mark where the barn used to stand. The checkpoint guard was young, maybe my grandson's age. He looked at my passport, then at the old compass dangling from my neck. "Antique?" he asked. "Gift," I said. He smiled and waved me through. It struck me how simple it was to cross a line that once defined who lived and who died. My father had crossed that same line carrying grain and blankets. I crossed it carrying a letter and his ghost beside me. The village was small. Fewer houses than I expected, roofs of tin and clay. Children ran barefoot through narrow lanes, their laughter bright against the quiet hills. I stopped at a tiny shop where an old man sold tea from a kettle blackened by years of use. He looked up from his stool when I mentioned 2 sisters who had once lived by the river decades ago. He stared for a long time, then nodded slowly. "You mean the teachers?" he said. "They passed some years back, but their school still stands down by the water." He poured me tea and pointed the way. When I thanked him, he waved it off. "Everyone thanks them," he said. "You're just later than most." The path to the river was steep and wild, covered in ferns and small yellow flowers. By the time I reached the bottom, I saw a small stone building, no bigger than a farmhouse, but painted white and trimmed in blue. Children's drawings covered the walls. A wooden sign read, "The River School." I stood there for a long while, listening to the sound of water and laughter mixing in the breeze. It felt almost unreal, as if time had paused to let me catch up. A woman stepped out from the doorway, maybe in her 50s. She looked at the compass hanging around my neck and froze. Then she smiled gently. "You must be his son." I didn't have to ask how she knew. She said her mother had been one of the sisters, the younger one. The one who had pressed that compass back into my father's hand. They'd kept his story alive through every generation. telling it to each new class of children who came to learn by the river. She led me inside. On the wall hung a framed photograph, black and white, faded with time. Two young girls stood beside a man in a worn jacket, smiling shyly into the camera. The caption beneath read, "The day Mercy returned." I left the letter there, tucked beneath the frame. The woman didn't stop me. She only said, "He came back twice. The first time to thank them, the second time to promise he'd never forget." I told her. He kept that promise. As I stepped outside, the river shimmered in the afternoon light. Calm, endless, certain. I understood then that my father hadn't just been saved by kindness. He'd been saved for it, so one day his story could bring me here to see what mercy leaves behind when it's passed forward. I stayed that night in the village, in a small guest room above the school. The woman who managed it, daughter of the younger sister, insisted I not sleep anywhere else. She said, "You've come a long way to finish a story. Let the walls that began it keep you tonight." The way she said it made my throat tighten. Through the open window I could hear the river murmuring below the hill, the same one that once carried my father's voice when he called for help. I wondered if sound could hold memory, if water remembered the weight of the people it had seen saved or lost. The power went out sometime after midnight, and I lit the small oil lamp by the bed. The flame wavered, painting shadows of the old photographs hung on the walls. Children, teachers, and faces I didn't know, but they all smiled in that same way the sisters had smiled at my father in his story. Gentle, unafraid, certain that kindness mattered more than the reasons it shouldn't. In the morning I walked through the village square. People waved as I passed, some even stopped to shake my hand. Word travels fast in small places. They called me the soldier's son. An elderly man sitting under a fig tree beckoned me closer. He had eyes like wet stones, old, heavy, kind. "You look just like him," he said. Tall, serious, quiet around the eyes. I told him I never knew my father that way. I only knew the man he became after he'd been saved. The old man smiled faintly. "Then you knew the best part of him." He told me that after my father's visit in '68, the sisters had decided to open their small school by the river, teaching children from both sides of the border. At first, no one believed it would work, but over time, the laughter of children drowned out old suspicions. Their kindness turned into lessons, he said, and their lessons turned into peace. I asked him what people remembered most about them. He said that they never stopped calling him the man who thanked us twice. Later that afternoon, I helped some of the students clean the courtyard. They were bright-eyed, curious about everything. One little boy asked me, "Was your father really from the other side?" I nodded. He frowned, thinking hard, then said, "But he said thank you." "Yes," I told him. "And he meant it." The boy grinned. Then maybe he wasn't the other side after all. I didn't have an answer for that, just a lump in my throat. When the school bell rang, the children scattered like a flock of birds, their laughter echoing down the hill. I stood by the doorway, looking at their drawings on the walls. Bridges, trees, rivers, people holding hands. There wasn't a single tank or uniform in sight. Only color. Only life. The woman from the night before joined me. She said, "They learn this story in their first week here, not as history, but as proof that being human comes first." I asked if they knew his name. She shook her head. "No, we never tell them that. They just know him as the man who said thank you twice." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I sat by the river. The air smelled of wild mint and smoke from kitchen fires. I opened my father's compass, the one those girls had once returned to him, and watched the needle steady itself. North, always north. But for the first time, I realized direction didn't matter as much as the journey that shaped it. I thought about how two little girls changed the course of one man's life, and how that one man's gratitude had built a school, healed a community, and somehow led his son right back to the same river half a century later. It struck me that mercy doesn't end where it begins. It ripples outward, quiet, unseen, unstoppable, like the river itself. At sunrise, the river shimmered like poured glass. Mist lifted off its surface in thin threads, curling upward into the pale gold of morning. The village was just waking, roosters, clattering pots, the faint hum of a song from somewhere behind the school. I knew it was time to leave, yet a part of me wanted to stay, as if leaving might break whatever fragile bridge connected the past to this moment. I packed my small bag and walked down to the school to thank the woman who had hosted me. She was standing by the doorway, arranging wildflowers into a clay vase. When she saw me, she smiled the way her mother must have once smiled at my father. "Going already?" she asked. I nodded. "If I stay longer, I'll forget to go home." She reached under the table and pulled out a small wrapped bundle. "Something that belonged to my mother," she said. I unfolded the cloth carefully. Inside was a pressed violet, the same kind my father used to keep in his notebook, and a small pendant made from a piece of river stone carved smooth by time. "She wore it every day," the woman said. Said it reminded her of the stranger who taught her that mercy has no borders. I couldn't speak for a moment. All I managed was, "Thank you." She shook her head gently. "It's not a gift. It's a return. These things belong to where they began." Before leaving, I asked if I could visit the hill one last time. She pointed to a narrow path behind the school. It wound upward through trees heavy with dew until I reached a small clearing overlooking the entire valley. The river glinted below like a thread of silver weaving through green cloth. Someone had built a small stone bench there, carved with words in 2 languages. "Kindness is the only border that never closes." I sat there for a long time. The breeze was cool and the trees whispered in slow rhythm. I imagined my father standing here decades earlier, maybe breathing the same air, seeing the same sky, wondering how 2 children's courage could undo everything war had taught him. For the first time since finding his letter, I felt something inside me loosen. The quiet ache of questions finally answered. He hadn't just been saved that day. He'd been rewritten, and I realized I had spent most of my life trying to understand the man he became, when all along I only needed to understand the children who showed him how to live again. As I started down the path, a small group of students ran up the hill carrying notebooks and chalkboards. Their teacher called out to me, "They're sketching the valley today. It's their peace lesson." One of the boys looked up and asked, "Are you the soldier's son?" I smiled. "Something like that." He handed me a drawing. Rough lines of a river, 2 stick-figure girls, and a man lying beneath a tree. The boy said, "My teacher says that's where our story began." I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my pocket. "Then it's where mine ends," I said softly. Back at the guest house, I left a note of my own before I left. It was simple. "Your kindness reached him and through him reached me. Thank you for keeping it alive." Beside it, I placed the compass. My father's old one. Its brass was worn smooth, the glass scratched, but the needle still true. I figured it had finally pointed me where I needed to go. The woman found me as I reached the road out of town. "You're leaving something behind," she said. I nodded. "That's the point." As the bus wound down the hill, I looked out through the dusty window one last time. The school shrank to a white dot beside the shining river, and beyond it the hills faded into soft blue haze. I thought of my father's words written long ago in his notebook. Kindness doesn't need to be remembered to live on. He'd been right. Those girls never asked for gratitude, and yet their kindness had built a bridge that outlived them both. And now, their story, his story, had built another one through me. The pendant lay warm in my palm as the sunlight shifted across it, smooth and quiet like the river. I knew then that mercy doesn't end with the person who gives it or the one who receives it. It moves forward, carried by whoever chooses to remember. By the time I reached home, the city already felt louder than it should have. Car horns, voices, engines, all of it clashed against the quiet I'd carried back from the hills. I let myself into the house and set my small travel bag by the chair. The pendant still hung from my fingers, cool now instead of warm, as if the mountain air had gone with it. My grandson, Luke, was sitting at the kitchen table doing his schoolwork. He looked up, eyes curious. "You were gone 2 days," he said. "3, I corrected, smiling. "I went to visit a river." He frowned. "A river?" I sat down across from him and slid the folded drawing out of my pocket, the one a village boy had given me. 2 girls, 1 man, and a winding line of water. Luke studied it for a long time, then asked, "Is that the same man from your stories? The one you said got lost during the war?" "Yes," I said, "my father, your great-grandfather." He leaned forward. "Did you find him?" "In a way," I told him. I found what he left behind. That evening after dinner, the family gathered in the living room. It was one of those nights when the power flickered and everyone ended up in the same room because the dark felt friendlier together. I lit a small oil lamp, the same kind that had burned in that village, and the room filled with its steady glow. Luke asked me to tell the story again. I hesitated for a moment. I'd told it so many times before, but never like this. Never with an ending. So I began. I told them about the two girls who had found a wounded man on the edge of their land, how they had fed him, hidden him, and nursed him until he could stand again, how he had wanted to repay them, but they had only asked him to live a good life, how he had promised he would. I told them how years later that same man, my father, had built a bridge between two broken towns, not out of stone, but out of trust. How he had carried that compass in his pocket as a reminder of who he owed his second chance to, and how, when he died, he left behind a note that said only, "Thank them again for me." The room was quiet when I finished. My wife brushed her hand over Luke's hair. He was staring at the lamp, his eyes soft, his thoughts somewhere far away. After a while, he said, "Grandpa, those girls must have been really brave." "They were," I said. "And so was the man who learned from them." Later that night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone by the window. The city lights shimmered against the glass, but in my mind I saw the river again. Calm, silver, endless. I reached for the pendant around my neck and closed my fingers around it. It felt heavier now, not because of the stone, but because of the story it carried. I realized that my father's greatest act wasn't surviving. It was learning. He'd been raised to see borders, to measure worth by sides and uniforms, but two little girls had taught him something no map ever could, that mercy doesn't ask who you are before it reaches out its hand. And now, decades later, that same lesson had trickled down into my grandson's wide eyes, his questions, his wonder. It hadn't just been passed down through blood, it had survived through storytelling. Before turning in, I took my father's notebook from the shelf, the one I'd carried for most of my adult life without really knowing why. I turned to the last page and added a new line beneath his handwriting. "They saved you. You saved me. And now I'll save the story." The ink bled slightly into the old paper, joining my words to his. It felt right. Like finishing a sentence someone started long before I was born. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of rain. Soft, patient, familiar. I smiled. Somewhere far off, I imagined the river still moving through that quiet valley, whispering the same promise it had carried for generations. That kindness, once given, never truly stops moving. If you've stayed with me this long, I want to tell you something. Stories like this, they don't belong to one family, one war, or one lifetime. They belong to every person who's ever had the chance to show mercy and chose to take it. When I was a boy, I thought my father's silence meant he carried shame. He never spoke much about the war or what he'd done to survive it. But now I know, it wasn't shame he carried. It was gratitude too big for words. Those two little girls, they didn't just save a man, they saved everything that came after him. His marriage, his son, his grandson, all of it traces back to a moment when two children chose to help someone they were told not to. And if that isn't proof that compassion can rewrite a whole bloodline, I don't know what is. When I visited that village, I didn't just find the school or the river. I found what my father had been trying to teach me my whole life, even when he never said it aloud. That being good isn't about what you believe or where you're from or what uniform you wear. It's about what you do when someone who doesn't look like you needs your help. You see, kindness isn't a soft thing. It's brave. It's standing on the edge of fear and still deciding to reach out. And sometimes it's the smallest act that ends up outliving you. The pendant I wear now, the one carved from that river stone, it's more than a keepsake. It's a reminder that even the most ordinary people can do something extraordinary, just by choosing to care when it's hardest. That's what my father learned. That's what I've spent my life trying to remember. These days, when my grandson asks me for bedtime stories, I don't tell him about medals or victories. I tell him about mercy, about two girls who looked past a man's uniform and saw a person worth saving. And I tell him that every generation gets the same choice, to pass kindness forward or to let it die out. He always asks the same question at the end. "Grandpa, what happened to those girls?" And I tell him, "They grew up to build a school, a place where no one asks who's from which side." Then he smiles and says, "That sounds like heaven. Maybe it is." Now I want to leave you with something, just like my father left something for me. You don't have to be in a war to fight the good fight. You don't have to cross a river or rebuild a bridge to make peace. Sometimes it's enough to notice someone who's hurting and choose not to walk past. Because the truth is, the world doesn't change when powerful men make speeches. It changes when ordinary people make merciful choices. That's where history quietly bends. If my father were alive today, I think he'd still be wearing that old compass around his neck. It never stopped pointing north, but I like to think he learned something better: how to follow the direction of his heart. And if you've ever wondered whether the good you do matters, it does. Even if no one sees it, even if no one ever says thank you. Because mercy, once given, keeps moving. Through time, through family, through you. So when you finish this story and go back to your day, take one thing with you. Be the reason someone remembers kindness instead of cruelty. Be the proof that compassion still exists in a world that forgets too easily. That's what those two little girls were. That's what my father became. And that's what I hope you'll choose to be too. Now tell me, have you ever seen kindness change someone's life even in a small way? If you have, I'd like to hear about it in the comments, because stories like that, they're the ones worth keeping alive.